In high school, I was a pretty scrawny kid running track. I was so injured by the end of my freshman year, I decided to use weightlifting to gain strength. Football players and coaches snickered and thought it was temporary, but by senior year, I was fast, I had no injuries, and most importantly, we had a full-blown girls' weightlifting program. I surprised people when I went to art school instead of going into something sports-related. Not many people knew I was a choir geek and a die-hard art kid. I entered into college in Milwaukee, Wisconsin with a ton of galleries, museums, and artists around me. I had high expectations for my future in the art world and the kind of job I would hold. 9/11 happened my freshman year of college. My spouse was headed into the active military. I decided to take a semester off school to spend time with him in Tennessee before he deployed. People doubted I returned to school. I knew I would. I graduated while he was deployed. Being a military spouse wasn't easy. I felt lost moving from Milwaukee to Tennessee. I worked at various museums wherever I was, but I was looking for something beyond the stress of deployments. I enrolled in a master's program for museum studies at the University of Louisville. I wrote my thesis on a Chicago artist, curated a show of her work, and interned at the Patton Museum. I still love the art world, but after years of contemporary art and theory, I felt a bit disconnected. I completed a second internship at the Kentucky Museum of Art and Craft. The museum celebrated the word the art world dreaded, craft. In fact, it thrived along Museum Row. Suddenly, museums felt less exclusive and elite. We moved to Champaign, and I had a small research position until I saw an opening for a director in Tuscola. They were trying one last push to save the museum. I wasn't always sure about local history in a small town. I was afraid people would be closed-minded. What I found within was a community of underdogs trying to change things. I found a home. Most local history museums have the same story of little funding, small to no staff, and little community support. So why is it local museums struggle so much in the days of 23andMe, Ancestry.com, shop local, spend local? Why aren't people supporting local museums that preserve genealogical information? My great-grandmother immigrated at 21 from Poland before World War II. She carried a postcard picturing her parents with numbers around their neck. A stamp in the corners told us they were at Kaiserwald concentration camp and never heard from again. This is just one story within a large statistic, yet I suddenly felt connected to something in history. Here are some common statements about history. Number one, I question the history I'm told about if it's true. History has buried many diverse experiences. Local history museums contain primary resources. The experience of one can support something we've learned, or it can uncover an experience missing from our history books. Number two, local history isn't relevant to me. Malcolm Gladwell's book, David and Goliath, states, "We form our impressions not globally by placing ourselves in the broadest possible context, but locally by comparing ourselves to people in the same boat as ourselves. A cardboard box stashed away for years addressed to a mother who lost her son in war speaks volumes of loss and grief." I don't need this dusty old stuff. We live in a throwaway society. Many items end up in local history museums because the next generation doesn't want it. We value experience over things, but we forget that everyday things can be full of meaning. Local history is boring. It's not that interesting and diverse stories don't exist, but that they are buried and take more effort to uncover. My first impression at DCM was a women's work exhibit with a collection of paint-by numbers and the label, "What Women Do When They Are Trying to Avoid Housework." Not very inspiring. Here are some of the people I've found. Minnie Jolly loved to fly airplanes and loved jumping out of them. She served as a cap in World War II at a time when many thought women would panic the moment a plane blew a fuse. Minnie had to build her own propeller and engine to qualify for service. She jumped out of planes to prep for solo trips and was one of only 12 women in the National Parachute Jumpers Association. Musician Pete Bridgewater was raised in Tuscola, his father a cornet player for the circus. He and his brother both played in the U.S. Navy Jazz Band while units were still segregated. His sister-in-law Irma Scott was a jazz pianist and quiet revolutionary. Pete played bass and led in several bands. He was also a jazz DJ on WDWS radio. WDZ Radio, the third station in the entire nation, started in Tuscola. From its beginnings of reading the grain reports to its growth and explosion of music, where else would you hear names like Hillbilly Lou, the Utah Wranglers, and Sweetheart Mary? Smiley Burnett, a singer-songwriter, comedic actor, and sidekicks to the likes of Gene Autry, got their start there. Marjorie Carlson was the first woman to major in botany and the first full-time female professor at Northwestern University. She was a research assistant at the Field Museum, made trips to Mexico and Central America with her partner, Kate Staley. Traveling the dense jungles, trained by jeep, airplane, and ox, they discovered new plant species and collected them. The moral of the story is that local history is full of badass people who prove that wherever you're from, you too can be a badass. Everyday events become extraordinary. Local people do extraordinary things. We can give people a sense of pride and inspire future generations by showing them people like themselves who've pushed boundaries. Local history museums are a wealth of information, but they constantly struggle with funding and staffing. Being an underdog has its advantages, though. It allows for more flexibility to try different things. Desperate situations call for desperate measures, and the underdog has to adapt. They know failure and they aren't afraid of it. No one expects much from them. At the museum, we recently passed a county-wide vote, the formation of a historical museum district, which created a sustainable source of basic funding. There are only a few of these in the US. We would have never tried to get that passed had we not been an underdog. Just think of what a hint of new voices and public support can do to make local history museums feel more representative and relevant. Thank you.